This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'm back with another episode of the international edition of the FCPA Compliance Report. Today I have with me Luciana Silveira. She is a PhD candidate at the Catholic University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's recently completed a term as a Fulbright researcher at American University at the Washington College of Law. And she is working on a very interesting project where she is researching the intersection of the FCPA and its impact on international trade transactions as an experience to the potential impacts of the Brazilian Clean Company Act. She is providing, or rather trying to generate a quantitative analysis regarding merchandise trade flows, and she's developed a questionnaire, which I'm going to link to in the show notes, to help measure personal opinion of corporate employees on how the FCPA has impacted corporate business abroad. This will help her try to put together a plan to help guide the enforcement and compliance with the Brazilian Clean Companies Act. It's a fascinating podcast. I hope that you will take her survey. It's only 15 questions, anonymous, and it's very short. And it will greatly help her and will give you, the U.S. compliance practitioner, an opportunity to perhaps influence the Brazilian Clean Companies Act and how it is complied with. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to the international edition of the FCPA Compliance Report. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again, back for another edition of the FCPA Compliance Report, the international edition. Today, you're in for a real treat because I have with me Luciana Silveira. She is a student at American University. You're a lawyer in Brazil, correct?
Correct.
But she is up here doing some really interesting research, or continuation of some research she started in Brazil. We met a couple of years ago when I was at a conference, and we've corresponded over the years. And she's here to tell us about her research, and more importantly for the listeners, how they might be able to help her in her research, because she's going to have some questions that she wants to put to you at the end that we'll link to in the show notes. So, Luciana, with that very long-winded introduction, thank you very much for taking the time to visit with me. And I should also say we're on location here at Compliance Week 2017, so thank you for coming down to the Mayflower.
Thank you, Tom, for having me and giving me the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about my research. So basically, I'm here in DC. It's been almost 9 months now. I got a Fulbright scholarship to develop part of my PhD research. I'm enrolled in my PhD back home in Brazil with Pontifícia Universidade Católica. And I'm doing this research mostly because I'm trying to understand a little bit the impacts of the FCPA to U.S. companies doing business abroad, and from that draw a parallel of what could be the impacts of the Clean Company Act that we have enacted recently in Brazil to Brazilian companies doing business abroad. Like you said, I'm a lawyer. I worked in the past in law firms for a long time with international trade, so mostly WTO, customs regulations, trade remedies, and I decided to combine my academic interests with my practice and doing my research both with international trade and anti-corruption. So understanding the interaction of these two areas and how anti-corruption measures affect international trade. After a while, I changed to in-house. So I've been for almost 2 years running the compliance department of a mining company in Brazil. And from my day-to-day practice, I came to realize that anti-corruption laws, they play a major role in the business decision-making, where to export, where to outsource, where to do business. And I decided to narrow down my research to the impacts of anti-corruption legislations to international trade. And thinking of that particular topic, I couldn't go anywhere else than the U.S. I mean, U.S. was the first country to implement this sort of legislation. It's been in place for a long time. It had, in the beginning, the first 20 years, more or less, it wasn't so enforced, but over the past years, it has been enforced greatly, and it has changed a lot how companies here in the U.S. do business abroad because of the legislation and because of the FCPA. So my idea is to develop both a quantitative and qualitative assessment of how the FCPA impacted companies, U.S. companies doing business abroad, and from that see what is applicable and what can I bring back home to prepare the private sector on how to apply the measures that are necessary to be implemented in their business to have the positive impacts more than the negative impacts in their business, and also some suggestions that maybe I could put forward to the public sector in how to achieve a better result in terms of the enforcement of the legislation.
So both the public sector and private sector component to your research, and hopefully to the findings and what you might recommend at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's the idea with the research.
So can you explain the difference in the academic or research you would, that your school of study in Brazil as opposed to what you're doing up here in the United States, if there is any difference?
I don't know if there would be substantial differences. What I've been doing here mostly is talking to companies that are active in international trade, that do business abroad, either import or export. Understanding how they see the impact of the legislation to their business, whether they see that the flows of import or export has decreased, has increased, whether they decided to shift their operations from from countries where corruption is perceived to be higher than others. So there will be what we call a trade diversion. So understand how they see those impacts in terms of quantitative impacts, and also qualitative. So what measures were fostered inside of the companies because of the FCPA, how they changed the mentality of the company, the culture of the company, and whether they see a difference, whether they see positive impacts, negative impacts, how they deal with those impacts, and also talking to some government officials, both at the SEC and DOJ, how they see the impacts of the FCPA, how they, from their experiences in investigations, what has changed from investigations, I don't know, maybe 20, 10 years ago to investigations that are being conducted now. We have seen, I came to understand after I came to the U.S. That DOJ recently hired someone from the private, with a background from the private sector, to better analyze the compliance programs in place in companies, to see, ask the right questions, to see how the compliance program is working and whether it's preventing anti-corruption, whether it's preventing corruption to happen in their business. And I've talked also with some other public officials, government officials from Department of Commerce, Department of State, to understand how they see the impact of the FCPA in their activities as well. I mean,
that's fascinating. Yes.
If let's say we're promoting, U.S. is promoting trade, is promoting exports, the idea is to promote clean exports.
Right.
And how is the Department of Commerce connecting these two areas in their programs, in their agendas?
Have you seen that connection, or were they able to make a connection for you in your preliminary research?
Yes. From what I've talked to people and documents that I could see, they're doing this connection. I think it's something that it's at least on paper it's there, and this is something that going back to Brazil, this is more or less the same path that I want to take. So talking to the administrative authorities that are going to be responsible for investigating corruption acts under the Clean Company Act, and see how they perceive the impacts or the requirements that companies will have to bear in terms of the Clean Company Act obligations now, and also how the Ministry of Trade is going to do this connection, how they expect to do this connection, if they are in the first place expecting to do this connection and willing to do so. So I don't know if, going back to your question, I don't know if I see a major difference in terms of what I'm doing here and what I would do in Brazil now that I'm back. I think I've developed a lot of my research here, and because I was able to connect to so many people in the private sector, in the public sector, and also in the academic field, I've had so many ideas, and I was able to gather so much information that I don't think I would have been able to do in Brazil. And all this information gave me a lot of ideas on how to proceed with my research, how to do this comparative studies, and suggestions of how can I go forward with some proposals of how the private sector will do better in Brazil, and how the public sector can also do better in terms of the anti-corruption agenda in international trade.
Well, I'm particularly fascinated by your thoughts and research around the topic of connecting the benefits to U.S. trade with laws such as the FCPA, because the FCPA was passed really with a different focus, which was to stop American companies from paying bribes, but also to protect American companies so that if a foreign official came and demanded a bribe, the American company could rightly say, well, it would be illegal for us to do so. The benefits, the positive benefits that I see in the marketplace are really came to the fore, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years, but it's now something we're starting to see either U.S. officials talk about or former officials talk about, that it really does benefit U.S. companies to have this law in place, so that when a foreign government or a state-owned enterprise, such as Petrobras, for instance, would purchase services or products from an American company, they would know they were getting clean products and services. So I'd be fascinated to see if you can really link that up in a qualitative and quantitative way.
Absolutely. In terms of the quantitative study, what I wanted to do is eliminate the impacts of other variables to international trade, and see how would the U.S. trade have behaved throughout all the years of the implementation of the FCPA, and from that understand what was actually the impact of the FCPA, if there was any impact. I mean, There are many other variables, and there is the argument, there have been some studies that try to do this, and there are many variables that have an influence on international trade, and there is the argument that, well, all these other variables, they have a major force, or their force is let's say bigger than the FCPA force in terms of influencing international trade, and that the result would therefore be that international trade is going with the flow of globalization and economic integration despite the FCPA, and the FCPA is just another regulation that impacts international trade so much as, for instance, other regulations that are applicable to companies doing business abroad. So on top of the econometric study, the idea was to have also a qualitative study in seeing how individuals see the impact, how they, in their experience, corporate employees, how they see the FCPA impacting their day-to-day activities. And for that purpose, I developed a survey. It's a very short survey. I've been circulating among some corporate employees that I've talked to and some other contacts, and the idea is to see their personal take in what was the impact of the FCPA so far. And and the preliminary results so far have indicated that, like we talked before, I mean, there is some trade diversion in the sense that companies are maybe doing less trade with corrupt countries or in corrupt countries and more trade in cleaner countries. But there has also been the argument that, well, it's a shield, it's good for us, we're protecting ourselves, we have a proper justification for not engaging in corrupt activities. And whenever it's something that we cannot do, we cannot engage in that act without being involved in corrupt acts, then we just move to another market. And this is something that it's the culture of the company now, and it's just regardless of the FCPA. We're just doing it because it's better to do it this way.
Well, if I could flip that around from the business perspective, what I might say is that because of the FCPA, it's too risky to do business in certain countries. And as a businessman or a CEO or a corporate executive, frankly, I'm just not willing to take that risk.
Absolutely.
I do have a product that I can move into another market, less risky, have to put less risk management around it, and I'll make a higher profit because it's less risky. So absolutely, trade diversion, what a great way to think through exactly that kind of risk analysis that I might talk a businessman. So one of the things we're going to ask people to do at the end of this podcast is to take your survey, and we'll link to that in the show notes so that people can do so. But I was wondering if, since I have you here and you're from Brazil, and we've recently heard that there is issues around Brazil, but I'd like to actually talk to you from the perspective of someone who has worked in private practice, lawyer, and then went in-house. And how are Brazilian companies responding to all of the investigations? Are they moving toward some of the things that you would like to see in terms of having a more robust compliance program, making it part of their culture? And do you my sense from being in Brazil is the individual Brazilian is sick and tired of public corruption. But does that extend to companies as well, where they'll be willing to accept or embrace a culture that, as you would say, clean?
I'm a very positive person in terms of this change, even in the public sector. Regarding how companies are reacting to this, if you go to Brazil now and you talk to people who work in big corporations, pretty much all of them now have or are hiring compliance experts. They have in the past 2 years, these companies, they have developed robust compliance programs. They are in the learning process. They are willing to pass new policies internally, to do trainings, to go abroad and do trainings with their third-party agents. They are indeed engaged in changing the culture inside of their corporations. I think this is something that it totally changed. I'm not going to say it's if you compare here in the U.S., I think the FCPA had a major role in changing the culture in the companies.
Right.
Whereas in Brazil, I think the corruption scandals, domestic corruption scandals, they played a major role in trying to change this culture for corporations. With the Clean Company Act, similar to the FCPA, also has an extraterritorial reach. The FCPA only has the extraterritorial reach. The Clean Company Act holds corporations liable for both domestic and international corruption. But so far, there hasn't been many cases in international corruption. There hasn't been any at all. So I wouldn't link this change in the culture to the Clean Company Act itself, but rather to the whole, like you said, scenario in Brazil, the anti-corruption scenario, that the civil society is just sick and tired of all the corruption that we're facing in Brazil. So I do see a change in the culture from corporations and law firms fostering this idea of being compliant with the legislations, all legislations for the sake of respecting more what we have in the law, and promoting a cleaner trade in general, either domestic or international.
One of the other things I've observed, being a Yankee sitting north of the border, is that we see many of those same issues arising in other countries in Latin America. And we see really what we think is a change in the way many Latin American countries are going to do business, possibly because of the Odebrecht scandal. There's a lot more public awareness of that. And so do you see that sort of the initiatives that you have been a part of in Brazil really moving to the rest of Latin America and really a move towards companies doing business cleaner and in compliance than perhaps they've done in the past?
I would even say that the other way around would maybe be something that's also interesting. You see, there are some other countries in Latin America who have passed legislation, anti-corruption legislations before Brazil.
Right.
I would say that some other countries in Latin America are also engaged first, maybe because they have a different economic landscape in their country, or because something else happened before than it happened in Brazil. But I would say that one aspect that would be very interesting to have in Brazil, and that in some other countries in Latin America is happening, is more of an open government strategy, and open contracting, transparency sort of thing. For instance, in Brazil nowadays, if you want to kind of have a track of the public contracts that were signed, if you go to the department, in theory they're all public contracts. But if you go there and you ask for a copy of the contract, it will take you, I don't know, like months, or I don't even know if they're going to give you a copy of the contract at all. And then there are many in public contracting. You have many amendments, you have changing prices, and you have subcontracting. And it's really hard to keep track of everything that's going on, although it was supposed to be public. So I think in that particular aspect, I think we're far behind. Brazil should have a more transparent system. We should be more organized. I would say that there might be the case that this information is not even so much accessible to the people in the government. So I think this is one point that I think we're far behind, and we could progress a lot in terms of transparency to have a cleaner environment in Brazil for public contracting.
And maybe end up with going a little bit different route. One of the things I've observed from compliance professionals such as yourself and your colleagues in Brazil is you all are very passionate about compliance. You're very passionate about doing business, as you would say, cleanly. And you're really bringing that, even your legal background and your legal expertise, to the business solution of doing business, doing compliance and making it a part of the business. Would you say that's a fair characterization, just that you and your colleagues are very passionate about compliance?
Well, I would like to say yes. I like to believe that everyone working with compliance now in Brazil is, like myself, positive about the future outcomes of this new trend that we're having in Brazil. I'm sure that sometimes we have some setbacks with all this new waves of corruption scandals in Brazil.
Delicately put.
Yeah. But I don't know. I kind of I see we have an expression in Portuguese. I don't know if it's the same in English, but we see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
And I like to see that as an optimistic future, let's say.
So I wanted to ask if anyone wanted to contact you via email on any of the things you've talked about, or find out more about your academic work, could they do so? And if
Absolutely.
so, how would they do it?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. It's Luciana Silveira. And
Could you spell that?
Absolutely. Luciana last name Silveira. And also by email, it's LDOSILVEIRA@gmail.com. That's my personal email. Just feel free to send me an email, ask questions, or anything that I can maybe assist. It will be my pleasure.
Well, this has been just a fascinating topic for me. I'm really looking forward to is it a dissertation you're writing?
Yes, it is.
So,
it will be in Portuguese.
Well, you're going to have to get it translated.
Yeah, but I hope to have at least. I hope I'm able to have some pieces written in English from that dissertation. So,
well, I look very much look forward to it and your quantitative and qualitative analysis. And thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the international edition of the FCPA Compliance Report. As I indicated to you, I will link to Luciana's survey in the show notes. Please take the survey. It would help her develop a quantitative basis to give some insight into how the Brazilian Clean Company Act should be complied with in Brazil and across the globe. Also, if you would rate this podcast, if you've listened to us on iTunes, it would help us in our rankings and also help get the word about the only internationally focused compliance podcast currently in the United States. Finally, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you for joining me for this episode, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of the international edition of the FCPA Compliance Report.